Hello, folks. My name is DC Rockwell, and this is your co-host, Elio Grieco. Welcome to Code and Chaos, a pseudo-random conversation that starts with tech and ends where it ends, an hour or two later. Tonight, we're going to talk about law and code, or law and disorder. It's been brought up a few times in the past, in different conversations. Why can't we just write our laws in some sort of programming language to make it so this way they're not interpretable? That they're, we have the law, we set what the law is, and then we sort of run a script, and then we don't need judges, then we don't need, jurors, we don't need lawyers. We could just get an app and have this app start lawyering for us. I've gone back and forth over the years trying to think of some sort of way to make that work, just to be put in my place by people much smarter than me many, many times, until I realized that this just will not work. And so today we're going to discuss why not. Why won't this work? And what kind of examples do we have to exemplify why this won't work? So, Elio, what's your background like? What kind of conversations have you had around the idea of codifying law with technology?
Yeah, well, I have no formal legal training. Starts by saying that none of this is actual. I know enough to say we're not giving any legal advice. We're just speculating on the broader concepts here. But I have friends who are lawyers. I've done enough stuff with lawyers that I have some exposure. But yeah, this is something that hopefully, just in the description of what if we could take humans out of the law, anyone who has legal training or anyone who's just thought a little more deeply about what is the purpose of the law, that should be horrific. That should be a terrifying thing to hear. And the law really, in my personal opinion, should be ideally about finding justice. And the law itself and justice are not the same thing. The law should attempt to provide justice. It's a set of rules that we all agree to that should allow us to come to just decisions. But there's a lot of cases where that doesn't work. And I think, just like any bit of code, the law is kind of like code, but it's interpreted by humans rather than by computers. And I think it should stay that way. Probably forever. I don't think ever handing over the law, and we'll discuss this in more detail, but I think you want humans in that loop. And the more you try to turn it into just dumb rules, the more sideways it's going to go and the worse the outcomes are going to be.
I agree. So how about we start with the biggest law document of them all, the one most cited, the one that most people think is the most static. The Constitution of the United States of America. So the reason why I want to bring this up and start here is because I have heard, especially this year, by people of all different political backgrounds, say things like, that's against the Constitution, or I'm defending the Constitution. And whenever I hear the words "the" and Constitution put together, I'm always brought back to this particular document from the Congressional Research Service. It's called Modes of Constitutional Interpretation by Brandon J. Murrell. It was published on March 15th, 2018, but the ideas in this are not new. And we're not going to go through the whole thing, but I do want to just point out the summary here. And we're not going to read the whole thing, but what it does is it breaks down different ways that the Constitution can be interpreted, in vastly different ways, as you'll see. For example, we have, let's just go over the list of it, the list of the modes. There's textualism, original meaning, judicial precedent, pragmatism, moral reasoning, national identity or ethos, structuralism, and historical practices. And we'll just quickly give the first line from each of these. So textualism is a mode of interpretation that focuses on the plain meaning of the text of a legal document. And so in the Constitution, it would emphasize how the terms in the Constitution would be understood by people at the time they were ratified, as well as the context in which those terms appear. But then there's also original meaning, which is a textualist approach to the interpretation of the Constitution that solely focuses on the text of the document. Originalist approaches consider the meaning of the Constitution as understood by at least some segment of the populace at the time of the founding. And then there's judicial precedent, the most commonly cited source of constitutional meaning, which depends upon the Supreme Court's prior decisions on questions of constitutional law. Pragmatism often involves the court weighing in or balancing the probable practical consequences of one interpretation of the Constitution against other interpretations. Moral reasoning is an approach that argues that certain moral concepts or ideals underlie some terms in the text of the Constitution. National identity is judicial reasoning that occasionally relies on the concept of a national ethos, which draws upon distinct character and values of the American national identity. Structuralism is another mode of constitutional interpretation that draws inferences from the design of the Constitution, the relationships amongst the three branches of the federal government, also known as the separation of powers, the relationship between the federal and state governments, known as federalism, and the relationship between the government and the people. And then there's historical practices, which is all about prior decisions of the political branches, particularly their long-established historical practices as an important source of constitutional meaning. When somebody says the Constitution to me, I immediately follow it up with, which mode of interpretation are we talking about? Are we talking about, because in one single conversation, I've had folks move between these different modes of interpretation based upon which ones aren't working currently in making their point. So, for example, if they make an argument to moral reasoning and you shoot that down, they might move on to national identity, or they might just say, well, it's what the founding fathers wanted, and move on to the original meaning, or judicial precedent is the most often cited one. So what this shows, and also I think another important thing to cite here is this book I read a long time ago by Howard Zinn, and it's let's see if I can just pull this up. But the essentially in the beginning, when the Constitution was first published, there were basically three major understandings of every single one of these clauses, every single one of the paragraphs in it, where you had a conservative group that had a conservative understanding of every one of these paragraphs, and then there was also the the liberal understanding, and then a centrist's understanding, and so. What I think is interesting about this, and this was all outlined in Howard Zinn's book, People's History of the United States. What I think is interesting about this is that from the very beginning, we have had to interpret our laws. That the way that they're written do not exactly convey a static meaning, one that everyone is going to agree upon. And so this sort of begs the question, is there some sort of way that we can write our laws that would have a static understanding, a static meaning, something that everyone can agree upon, that would make it so this way we can't have people who can just switch which mode of interpretation they're using at any given time in order to fit their arguments. And so that seems to it seems to bring us to a place where it seems to imply that there's this ideal form of how we could write law that might be better than how it's currently written, as interpretable language. And yet, when you go down that rabbit hole and you actually do start to think of what would a constitutional programming language look like, you have to then start asking questions like, who would actually do the programming? What is that the new bar by which somebody could be elected to office? Is that they have to be versed in this new programming language, for example? And that's just like the start of some of the problems. What are some of the problems that you could see right off the bat in the idea of a static language with that would convey a single meaning to just constitutional law, for example?
Well, yeah, there's two issues there. So one, there's an constructed language called Logban or Loglan. I think the original one was Loglan, logical language, and then they redid it in itself, and it's Logban now, or Logban, excuse me. And it's constructed so it's easy to parse for machines and humans, and so certain types of words have certain roots. And the whole thing, unlike most languages, which just kind of evolve over time and mix and blend, and English is a big soup of all different languages, a whole bunch of Romance languages, but some bits from some others. This one is constructed to have specific goals, mostly to be totally unambiguous. And in some areas, I think ambiguity is fun. It's interesting. It's creative. If you look at puns and wordplay, and it's just playing around with where things collide. And I'm trying to think of a good example. The one that's immediately coming to mind is, what was it? Two wrongs don't make a right. And then there's, of course, the two Wongs don't make a right. There is a famous architect Wong and Frank Lloyd Wright, but Wong isn't as famous as Frank Lloyd Wright. So kind of playing on similar sounds there. And there's all kinds of stuff you can do and just kind of play around. But those same little fun inspirations, little bits of misunderstanding that are, I think, not the root of creativity, but sometimes you hear about. So great example, actually, and I'm going to date myself with the movie. The movie from way back when we were kids, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. And they had a behind the scenes thing, and they have this horrific beast, the monkey spider. And how that came into being, there's these little mites, little red dots you see, in the garden, usually sometimes around the house. They're just like a little tiny dot. Those are also called money spiders. And so they were talking about being shrunk down and how little bitty things would be huge to you. And he's telling the special effects artist, yeah, we should put a money spider in there. And he misheard monkey spider. So there's this weird spider monkey hybrid in the movie because of a misunderstanding, because the language was ambiguous. Those two things sound the same, and it was never clarified. So I think, and there's also the famous case of the Oxford comma recently. There was a whole court case to the tune of several $1 million where they didn't use the Oxford comma, where you say this comma, and this. And a lot of people write in the AP style, they don't like that comma. It's this comma, this and this. But the court was saying, in this case, you're saying this one thing and then the union, the and of these two other things. And that's not how they meant it. And it was like a multi-million-dollar judgment against them for using the Oxford comma. So ambiguity can cost you. So I think there's something to be said. And some countries kind of have an official language and then a whole bunch of other languages where, to save kind of trouble and money, they'll have official documents in the official language, and then citizens can speak whatever regional dialect or other languages they want. But you have to know the official language to do any kind of business or legal stuff. So there's already precedent for that. And I think, at least in theory, like understanding a language that is unambiguous for law and medicine and potentially science probably is helpful. I mean, I can't say for sure, but I'm guessing that fewer misunderstandings in law, medicine, and science probably is going to be a good thing that might save lives and save a lot of trouble. So there's that aspect of ambiguity is not a good thing. You don't really want ambiguity. And a lot of legal contracts, they have preambles of pages specifying exactly what this term means. And in this context, this word means this thing. And those can go for pages, so that if there's any debate about what exactly is meant later in the contract, we're not using the standard meanings we've already had in the preamble. We've said this means this thing. When we say the company, for instance, that way you can also template, basically. You could say the company, and in the preamble, you'll say the company means this specific entity or this group of people, so that when we say the company, we mean this company for this case, not, some other random company. So there's that. Now, as far as the code and putting the law into code, I mean, like I said, that's kind of what law already is. It's kind of a set of instructions that need to be interpreted by people to, I would, again, my personal opinion, ideally to arrive at a just decision. That should be the goal. And whenever the law and the justice diverge, in my opinion, we should go, modify the law to try to bring us back toward a just outcome. I don't think that's everyone's opinion. It would be interesting to hear from people, judges, lawyers, people with actual legal background, what their thoughts are on that. But my personal opinion is we should always attempt to have a just society. So that's where you run into some problems, though, is what the law says doesn't always make allowances. There's always weird side cases. There's always weird little, just like in code, there's corner cases where the thing that most of the time is obviously the right thing to do is occasionally like the wrong thing to do. And, I hate to this early in the show bring it to somewhere so dark, but there is, for anyone who has kids or works with kids, especially, approaching teenage years or slightly under, there's a really good Human Rights Watch report called Raised on the Registry, and not a fun read. It's about 120 pages, really enlightening. And I've been following Bruce Schneier and reading his stuff, his books and his blog for many, many years. And he's written again and again about, children's safety, generally our ability to estimate risk. And people are pretty bad at that. But especially when you bring kids into the mix, people are terrible. There's like a 10x multiplier minimum where any risk that's perceived is just multiplied when it's, when we're talking about risk to kids, suddenly it's that much worse. And so we like vastly overestimate certain risks and end up underestimating other real ones. And so Raised on the Registry, though, is specifically about cases where laws intended to protect children and keep them safe. So these are anti-exploitation laws and laws against, distributing and, possessing child pornography. Well, back when we were kids, cameras were expensive and rare. So, kids didn't get cameras, or they got these, tiny little toys. And again, you only had so many pictures and then you're out of film, and maybe 30 shots a roll or even less. Pack of Polaroids is 5 or 10 and you're out. So you got to be real careful, real sure that picture you're going to take is worth the film and the money, because you're not going to get to do that again for a while till you get more film. So now, of course, lots of kids, almost every adult and lots of kids have these. And they have cameras all over, camera on the front, multiple cameras on the back on a lot of the modern phones. And they're high quality. And the storage, like my phone, is relatively recent. This thing has, 256. I think I have quarter terabyte, 256 gigs of storage, which is basically take as many pictures as you want. You'd be having, if to fill that up with just pictures. Video would go a little faster, but if you're just taking pictures, you'd be shooting pictures like sun up to sundown. You'd be Instagramming the heck out of like everything, and it'd probably take you will probably replace your phone years before you get anywhere near actually filling up that kind of storage. So there's really no incentive no disincentive to take a picture of just literally anything and everything. And you can delete them really easily and redo it. So even if you did run into storage issues, it's not a big deal. So you give cameras to kids, and by their nature, kids are young. They haven't lived. They haven't had time to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes, or just learn from other people making mistakes. So they do dumb stuff and they try stuff. And so obviously they're going to take pictures. And by the nature of their age, if they take pictures of themselves in compromising situations, unclothed, for instance, that can be problematic. And so there are laws that are supposed to protect kids from having those pictures taken of them and traded and all this that are supposed to apply to adults. The problem was, when the laws were made, we didn't actually specify this only applies to adults. So if a kid takes a picture of themselves when they're in the bathroom, potentially they have just created an illegal photo. And there's a whole bunch of issues that are detailed in this report of, kids below the age of consent taking pictures and sending them to each other. And a lot of the times, everyone involved, and this is where you want humans in the loop. A lot of the times, people are like, all right, yeah, they're a kid, delete the pictures. We'll have a talk with them. You can't do this, or we'll take away your phone until you learn better, whatever. Not a big deal, right? But the problem is, every once in a while, one of the families has it out for the other family, and they're like, no, I'm pressing charges. And because the law does not make an allowance and say it's just kids doing stupid kid things, they get put on the sex offender registry before they're even old enough to, they're not anywhere near 18. And so there are cases where, one of the ones I remember from the story, this kid got, caught up in this, got put on the registry. And the sex offender registry, if you're listed, it doesn't matter what age you are, you can't actually be put on there as a kid. You can't live around kids. So he had two sisters. And so suddenly the family got split in half. They actually had to buy an apartment in town, and he couldn't live with his sisters. It said you can't live with kids under this age once you're on the registry. So mom and dad now had to swap places, and one of them would spend time with the daughters and one would spend time with the son. And he hadn't done anything horrific. He had just, exchanged naked pictures with his girlfriend at the time, and they were both underage, and parents pressed charges. And now for the rest of his life, he's on the registry. And the other interesting thing that stuck with me from that is the ages listed on the registry. The age of the perpetrator is updated. The age of the victim isn't. And so if you're 12 and 13 and you got caught up because you did stupid stuff and now you're listed on the registry, well, a year or two later, you're like, oh, well, of course, you guys basically the same age. You just got caught up in a stupid law. But 10 years later, when you're 22 and there's a 13-year-old on there, and then you're 32 and there's a 13-year-old on there, just over time, it looks like the crime is worse and worse and worse and worse. And so this is the kind of thing, when you try to just codify and you take humans out of the loop and you try to just make it purely about what's written there, you end up doing really horrible things and having these awful consequences when you just stupidly follow the law. So this is why, and by the way, I'm not going to say it's all fixed. I know some states, I'm assuming partly because of that, partly because of some of Schneier's writings, partly because of efforts of other people. I'm not really up on this stuff, but I followed a little bit over the decades because Schneier keeps coming back to it occasionally. They have changed some laws, and they've updated that. And there are now exemptions where if it's one of these cases where there's no actual crime, no actual, nothing awful happened, it was just kids because they shouldn't have cameras that young doing stupid stuff. There are now exemptions in some states where it's like, okay, they're just kids. We're not going to charge them. We're not going to use the law designed to protect them to destroy their life forever and make sure they'll never get a decent job and all that. So this is the problem. This is kind of an extreme example of where the law goes when you just write the law and you can't possibly conceive of every last corner case of how it might go wrong later. And then you blindly follow the law without any humans in the loop. But it's like I said, an extreme place to start, but one good example.
It is a good example because, it's exemplifying what you had originally started with, which was that we should be pursuing not following the law, but obtaining justice, achieving justice. And the way I see this getting complicated is that, justice, I looked up the definition, and it goes to just behavior or treatment, the quality of being fair and reasonable. And then if you look up, just, what is just? It's based on or behaving according to what is morally right and fair. And, when you're looking at that as a definition for justice, it's kind of hard to pinpoint it. And I think that that's the point. It's that it's a philosophical exercise.
Yeah.
And this is very different from programming, from writing code, which is a logical exercise. And so I looked up logic as well, just to be sure. And that's reasoning conducted or assessed according to strict principles of validity. And so because there aren't any strict principles of validity for the example that you just gave, that it is contextual and it depends upon the people involved, the situation, and it depends upon the reasonability of that situation. Logic isn't the end all there. That is not. There aren't strict principles that we could validate.
Yeah.
With we could write out some strict principles and say that it would validate every single situation of that type without there being any philosophical interpretation. And this brings, this, I think this is the crux of the problem, which is that there are some things which logic is very poor at answering. And some of the and these are philosophical questions. What is the meaning of life? What is love? What is or the meaning of love? What is morally correct? What is the next right thing to do? These are things or just what is right. Mm-hmm. These are questions that I don't know of a logical system that can answer these in any kind of a satisfactory way. Not in all situations. And like you were saying, there are just too many variables, too many contexts to be able to codify. If we were to codify every single context ever that could be possible, we would end up writing a book that would be larger, I think, than the planet itself. It would have to involve every possibility of everything ever. And that's the whole point of philosophy, which is that we get to reason using some of the tools of logic. We get to use some logic, but we also get to override that logic when we notice that logic is leading us in a direction which has the practical effect of being against our chosen morals, or against what we have interpreted as ethical. And I mean, even ethics, it seems like that is something very difficult to codify as well. We could say, well, the golden rule and the silver rule, don't, treat others as you would like to be treated. Don't treat others like you would not like to be treated. That seems very easy to codify, but it's really not when you really get down to it. So what are your thoughts on the difference between logic and philosophy and the crossover between those two?
I don't know. I don't have a deep enough background, especially in philosophy, to really say, to give a satisfying answer there. I know from some light conversations, I have not really done some deep dives in reading in philosophy, but I have not. It's about finding the truth, I guess, is the gist of my understanding of philosophy. And logic is a helpful tool on that path, but it's not the only way to do that. And it's, there's some cases going back to the law. Part of what we look at, part of it is having incomplete knowledge and also intent. And there are some things that you're never going to know. You're not going to have access to that knowledge of whether someone did it or not. And then even if you do, there's also the intent. Like the law makes the distinction between manslaughter and murder one. A lot of that premeditated murder, there's a big difference between you were stupid and you were playing with your phone, or you were drinking whatever and you hit someone and killed them and you didn't mean to. That's manslaughter, right? You killed someone, you definitely killed someone, and we are not just going to let that go, because that's a problem. You're kind of a danger to society, at least a little bit. But there's a big difference between doing that unintentionally and causing a death accidentally versus you've been thinking and planning and really you're determined that you're going to get this person, you're going to try to get away with it. And so the law makes a number of distinctions there. There's multiple levels of murder charges, and then manslaughter is a separate charge that takes that into account. And that actually kind of ties in the intent thing. It's not directly related, but I want to mention an article that I'll probably mention. I've mentioned this to so many people so many times. There's a great article from 2004. It's called "What Color Are Your Bits?" and it's on the ANSUZ ANSUZ blog at sooke.bc.ca. And it's color, by the way. I couldn't find this for the longest time. Color is spelled with the British spelling, COLOUR. I just found this again.
Wow.
I was super happy like 2 weeks ago. I'm like, oh, there it is. I forgot to archive it. I'm going to archive it. It's still up. And it's a really interesting article. And it talks about some stuff it's a really, really interesting and winding kind of path through provenance. Like, where did something come from? Because in some areas of law, like copyright law, provenance is huge. And in computing, there both is and isn't provenance. And so they use color as there's a game. What was the game in the article here? A classic adventure game called Paranoia that's set in a extremely repressive, they have that crossed out, utopian future world run by the computer, who is your friend. So anyway, you can only access stuff. There's this color-coded hierarchy of clearances, and you can only access stuff that is at or below your clearance. And so you have to adjust your strategy. Like, you can't walk down a hallway that's orange if you don't have orange clearance or better. So it plays into the game. And color, they use as a proxy for provenance. Where did this come from? And in the real world, again, like if you download music, that's a huge thing. DRM has done a lot of damage to computing because we're trying to enforce provenance. And we're trying to say, because if you're listening to a song, like, we care a lot in the law about, okay, well, how did you come to be listening to that song? How did those bits make their way to you? If you bought it on a CD, then you have the legal right to have those bits and listen to that song. If you downloaded it off Napster, Nutella, BitTorrent, whatever's hot these days in terms of sharing files, you're not okay. Like, you illegally downloaded it according to the industry, and they're going to come after you. And remember, there was that fun time when we were younger when the music industry was suing 12-year-olds because they're like, we want our cut and we're going to sue the hell out of it. And by the way, that hasn't stopped. A younger friend of mine was running a not that young, but just an adult. He was running a server, and he let some of his friends use his server for some stuff, and someone downloaded a song they shouldn't have, and he actually got a notice served that they were going after him. And luckily, I have a few friends that are lawyers in the right area, and I hooked him up with I'm like, here, take care of him, help him out. And, they got it worked out. He ended up having to pay $12,000 because a friend of his, downloaded the wrong bits. So this is very much a thing. There's a lot of people that are really interested in where did you get that digital data from? And this article talks about how there is no, like, a bit is just a 1 or a 0. It's like bits don't actually move. We can copy a bit from one place to another, but we're not moving the bit. In the real world, if you have a painting or a wine or honey, there's this whole article about how a lot of the honey is adulterated. It's like watered down with corn syrup and junk from all over the world. And you could tell because if you get a microscope, you can look for pollen in the honey. Honeys should have pollen. Bees go to flowers. They collect pollen while they're collecting the nectar. So there should be the pollen of whatever local flowers that honey came from should be in the honey in some trace amount. And there's only a handful of labs, like 3 to 5 labs, like in the world, that actually can do an analysis and match the pollen and tell you exactly where on this planet a given sample of honey came from. And so that's awesome, right? That's built-in provenance data. If you give me a bit of honey, just a drop of honey, then I can tell you, if I have the right equipment, like intrinsically, unless that honey has been put through a high-speed centrifuge and the pollen has been removed from it, which is what they do before they then, adulterate it and mix it with corn syrup to bulk it up and sell it, same price, but it's a lot cheaper to manufacture when you're dumping in tons of corn syrup. So that you can erase provenance, but it takes a ton of work and specialized gear. But a lot of things in the real world have provenance kind of built in. In the analog world, there's carbon that's in every living thing. There are different things that get picked up and integrated, and you can tell where something is from. And again, paintings and art forgeries, you can look at the ink, what types of ink were used. And if someone's an amateur forger, it's like, oh, well, this ink is brand new. It's from this manufacturer. Clearly, this is not a 500-year-old painting because this paint, this pigment, this ink, if it's a line, pen and ink, like this didn't exist. This hasn't been around that long. There's no way this is a work of art that's 500 years old. So provenance data is a thing that in the real world, plenty of ways to figure out where something came from. And in bits, because we copy them, and a bit is just a 1 or a 0, there's nowhere else to kind of hide provenance data. There is no provenance data. And there's no way to say this group of bits definitely came from here. And because, again, it is digital, it's an on or an off, it's a pattern of bits, then it's perfect. As long as you copied it right, it's perfect. It's not like a Xerox machine where as you copy again and again and again, certain artifacts are left. Like when you're just copying digital bits, it's a perfect copy. And especially if we throw in some error correcting codes like in QR codes, it's always a perfect copy because we've used math to make sure if there are any differences, we can use some math and undo those differences. And it, just like DNA now, it keeps itself, well, we're not going to get into that whole conversation, but DNA has a lot of cool mechanisms to make sure it repairs itself and copies the same every time. It still doesn't always, but most of the time it's pretty amazing. And we have technologies that are similar, so we can make sure that that set of bits is always the exact same set of bits, theoretically forever or for a very long time. So anyway, great article. And then the final thing I won't go into now, we'll come back to it in a cryptography episode, but they talk about entropy, and bit provenance is really important in cryptography. That's the one area of computer science where we really, really, really care where those bits, we don't care what the bits are at all. That's the whole point. We care that the entropy source is good and it came from a good entropy source. And that's a whole nother conversation. We'll come back to that on a crypto primer episode. So anyway, there's some extra stuff, like I said, interpretability and provenance and what was the intent that how do you put that into code? I don't think you can.
Well, I think that's a good segue into a small dabble tonight into blockchain. I want to preface this next segment by saying that this
feast
weekend,
is Saturday.
The feast on blockchain is this Saturday. We have a special guest, which we will announce on Saturday. We'll let that be a surprise. That is going to come on here and discuss in-depth blockchain. But I do think provenance is sort of built into the idea of the hash in blockchain. It's saying that this particular hash, the hash on this was derived from the data on the previous block, for example.
So I'll disagree slightly on that. Yes, you could use a blockchain to establish provenance, but it's not the hash. What the hash is doing, the hash is giving you immutability because the type of hash you're using is a cryptographic hash. And one of the key properties of a cryptographic hash, which by the way, we're going to do some explainers on hashing. It really bothers me that people only know one type. There are 3 main types, 2 subtypes. But right now, all we're talking about in the context of blockchain, the only one we care about is generally cryptographic hashing, fast cryptographic hashing, not slow cryptographic hashing. And so in a fast cryptographic hash function, there's a thing that we look for called the avalanche effect. And because people are not good at, if I give you if I give you 2 strings that are 2 letters, A, like AA and BB, or AA and AB, like that's really easy for you to look at and be like, oh, the second one's different. It's A in the first one, it's B in the second one, right? It's really easy for you to analyze a tiny string. But if I give you a string that's like 80 characters long and it's all A's, and then the second one has 1 B in there, then you could still find the B pretty easily. But telling me which character it is quickly is going to be hard. You're going to have to count 1, 2, 3, and you might be off by 1 or 2. And if it's letters that look similar, if it's 2 strings and one is all L's and the other's all has 1 I in there or 1 in there, especially depending on the font, it's going to be really, really, really hard for you to tell that those aren't exactly the same. And, it gets a lot worse. This is actually a security issue called a homograph attack, where you use similar looking characters so that this happens in domains where you'll get, it looks like Google, GOOG1LE, so they'll swap out 1 letter, an L for a 1 or something, and you can't tell. So because of that, if we're using these hashes as fingerprints to stand in for the entire thing of data and compare 2 bits of data by computing their hash and then saying, are the hashes the same? The computer can look at the hashes and tell us if they're exactly the same or not. It's really good at that. But sometimes we want to be able to, at a glance, look at the hash and figure out whether it's the same or not. And so the avalanche effect means if you change one bit, just one bit anywhere in a big set of data, it could be, a huge file, one bit in a music file, just anything anywhere in there, something that no human would ever notice. When you compute the cryptographic hash function, it should look completely different. The entire string should be totally different, or as different as possible with a 1-bit change.
And you don't think that counts as provenance in the sense that you're saying that if these don't compute, then these blocks did not come from this chain?
So where the provenance comes from is actually just being able to look at what happened, what are the transactions. So the whole point, like the gist of a blockchain, is you make a block, which is just basically a document, and
Right.
you put data in there, and then you take a cryptographic hash of that, and then in the next block, you point to the previous block and say, this block, and use the cryptographic hash and say this block comes from that one. That's the previous one in the chain.
But
you keep doing that. And because of the avalanche effect, if you change one bit in one of the blocks, then its hash totally changes. And because that changes more than one bit in the next block, its hash totally changes. So the idea is if you change a block, any bit in any block anywhere in the chain, every subsequent block now is invalidated. All the hashes cascade. That avalanche effect travels up the chain,
right?
And you can tell. So it's tamper resistance.
But if I were to, for example, say, "Hey, look, here's the next block in this chain," you can use the hash on that to determine whether or not that really is a block which came from this particular chain. I'm saying. And so maybe it's not exactly the same thing as the other types of provenance, but to me, that's a way of saying, oh no, I'm sorry, that block doesn't actually, that block came from something else. It could not have come from our particular chain.
Yeah. Well, where the provenance does kick in a blockchain is a blockchain is generally used to record a ledger. And so a ledger is just a list of this happened, then this happened. And so in the case of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, that ledger is recording, I have this coin, and a coin is literally just a ridiculously uselessly large number. And when I say uselessly large, I mean, it's so big that you can't count the atoms in the universe. It's too big for that. You can't count up to it. If you started counting now, you would die long before you got even anywhere near a quarter of the way to that number. Like, it's just this enormous number. And for cryptographic purposes, we want a big key space. So huge numbers, uselessly large numbers.
Well,
but literally, Bitcoin is a system for us to all agree that I have control of this uselessly large number. This Bitcoin is mine. And then if I want to give it or some of it to you, then we can make a block and I can say, I am taking this uselessly large number, this Bitcoin, and I am assigning ownership to you, DC. This is your uselessly large number now. And we record that in the chain. And then that gets stuck in a chain that can't be modified. So forever after, we can actually trace where that uselessly large number, which people traded it around. And that's the basis of Bitcoin.
Okay, but let's leave the description and explanation of blockchain and cryptocurrency to Saturday. I really just wanted to use this as a segue into an actual attempt to codify law, and that this attempt to codify law, the folks who were involved in this went into this with the best of intentions. They went into this with the intention of creating something which exemplifies that code can be law. That code is, in fact, and in fact, they use the term "code is law." And so this is the story of Ethereum Classic, which they said code is law because they were using smart contracts in order to what's the best way to describe this? Because you know a lot. You have a deeper understanding of this.
I watched this whole fiasco. So I will say proudly, I own no cryptocurrency, zero crypto anything. I'd have a lot more money if I got into this scam early on. We'll get into that later, but I don't like cryptocurrency, as most people who know me already are well aware.
I'm sure you're going to repeat this on Saturday.
Yeah, there's interesting technology, there's interesting stuff, but overall it's a terrible idea. It's humanity's worst idea, and I'll come back. I'll leave that as a teaser. We'll do that in a later episode. But what they did is they came up with this idea. Well, like you said, they had this idea that code is law. Whatever's in the code is the law of Ethereum, is the law of Bitcoin. Whatever happens, that's the way it's supposed to be. And no human can come back and reinterpret it later and change it to something else. Whatever we write, that's exactly what it is. So, and they have a thing called smart contracts. So I've seen people at a hackathon and many other places misunderstand smart contracts. So there's Bitcoin, which does not have smart contracts, which is just a ledger of these uselessly large number, aka Bitcoin, and transferring those around. And like any other currency, you can trade around. Well, anyway, that's a whole nother thing. But you can trade around these Bitcoin. And if you find someone who's willing to give you real money or real goods to own this uselessly large number on the blockchain, then that's awesome for you, right? I have a friend who just bought a house. He actually traded some Bitcoin he had, and he was able to buy a brand new house. People actually gave him a house for a uselessly large number, which is awesome for him. But beyond that, they wanted to take that further. And what Ethereum wanted to do, what Vitalik and the rest of the team, they wanted to add the ability to have code that would kind of live in or on the blockchain, however you want to think of that. And certain events would trigger it. And so instead of just keeping track of who owns the uselessly large number, they wanted to be able to have the blockchain itself have code in the blockchain that when things would happen, it would know to automatically. So the idea was you could do stuff like if you're going to buy a house or buy a car, you could have a certain set of things that when these conditions were met, you could say, I want to buy your car, DC, but I want to check it out. I want to make sure it's in good shape. I want to, before I actually give you the money, right? I want to know a few things. So I intend to buy the car, and normally you could do this with an escrow service, but you could say, I intend to buy the car, and assuming these conditions are met, then this money, as long as the conditions are met, as soon as they are, this Ether, which is the currency in Ethereum, is going to transfer to you instantly as soon as these conditions are met. Now, some other time we'll dig into all the problems there's something called the Oracle problem, because the blockchain doesn't know everything. It's not some magical entity. So how does it know those conditions are met? And that's a huge problem that trying to actually solve that in a satisfactory way gets you into all kinds of weird contortions. And they just kind of wave their hands. I actually asked at a conference, there were hundreds of people, and this whole panel's talking about how awesome smart contracts are. And I'm like, so Oracle problem. What about that? How are you guys solving that? And he literally, in front of the whole conference, the guy telling everyone to go throw money into these stupid technologies. He's like, well, I'm sure someone will figure it out. Not like I've been to Decentralized Web Summit or I've been to a Bitcoin meetup and I talked to Vitalik, I talked to this other team working on this technology and they're getting close. We think that'll do it. But no, I'm sure someone as vague as someone as possible, someone on this earth will figure it out. Yeah, no confidence there. Anyway, so that's the idea, that you have these smart contracts. Now, the problem, because this whole code is law thing, is that you can't update these, because if you could push an update to a smart contract, still now you have a person coming in and potentially messing with it and going against the law, the code. So that's part of their features, is that once you push it out, once you push a smart contract out there, there's no way to fix it. If you pushed out broken code, because look at how many software updates you're supposed to run all the time. Everything's broken all the time. And the way we deal with that is by pushing a constant stream of also broken, but hopefully slightly less broken updates. So that critical piece is not there. You don't get that in smart contracts, which is also why smart contracts, one of the few good things that I like that Ethereum and smart contracts have done, there's a ton of research into formal methods to mathematically prove that what you put out there as a contract isn't broken in any way and doesn't have tricky little stuff you missed, because you cannot ever. And that's one area where at Stanford Blockchain Conference, before they renamed it, was BPACE, Blockchain Protocol Analysis and Security Engineering Conference back in 2018. There was a presentation about how every line in a smart contract, if you have a $400 million smart contract, which we'll get to in a second, then every line is, if it's 100 lines, then every line is worth $4 million, which is wrong. If you have a $400 million smart contract and you have a bug on one line that someone can use to empty the contract, every line is worth the entire value of the contract, not a portion of it. So their math was wrong. Anyway, so it'd be interesting if this happened. And oh, wait, it did, because there was an idea, seemed like a good idea at the time. It's called the DAO, the Decentralized Autonomous Organization. Although I like to pronounce it, Homer's catchphrase, I like to call it the DAO, because that's exactly what happens. So they put this out there. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, let's explain what this DAO is, but it sounds like you were already doing it.
But yeah, just always pronounce it with Homer's, inflection there, because this was a great example of where these ideas, when you try to put them in reality and you try to pull humans fully out of the loop on this one, things go real sideways real quick. And what happened was that they had this idea that we could all just put in a few dollars, a few fractions of an ether. I forget, the Satoshi is like 1,000 whatever of a Bitcoin. I forget what, you could break down ether as well. They're not as valuable as Bitcoin. They're $1,000 each right now. So the idea was that you could go ahead and you and I, DC, and anyone else on the planet who felt like throwing $5-10 worth of ether at the DAO, we could all invest together. Because the problem is right now, if I want to invent some crazy, insane technology, let's go with hoverboards. Everyone loves hoverboards. If I'm like, if someone's going to do hoverboards and like they have a good idea and it looks like it's actually going to work for reals this time, just like in the movie, let's fund it, right? That'd be cool. But I don't have enough money to fund development of anti-grav technology. But if we all pool our money together across the globe, and now we have a fund with like $500 million worth of ether, and someone is like, yeah, look, here's the paper. I got it to work out. I just need the money to actually build hoverboards and bring it to market. Then we could all vote on that. And we could all say, because we put in money, we now have the ability to vote on where the money goes. There's a smart contract that lets us do that. And someone could say, I propose we spend, $80 million on this hoverboard startup so we can all have our hoverboards. And everyone votes. And that's what triggers the smart contract. So there's no real Oracle problem there. It's all happening in the chain. So that's fine. And if the vote goes, then that money gets transferred to whatever the destination wallet, of that company is. And now they have all this money. They can cash that out for real money, US dollars or wherever they're located. And they can actually use that to build hoverboards. So that was the theory. Great theory. Very cool idea. I got to say, that would be great if we could do that. I think that would solve a lot of problems. However, the problem was when this all happened, this was pretty new and this stuff's really hard. It's really complicated. Getting code to run all over the world on literally, you don't know which computer it's going to run on. You have some problems. And one of those problems is in a Turing complete language, there's a thing called the halting problem. And so you don't actually know. It's impossible. It's mathematically impossible to tell just by looking at a program via static analysis whether when you run it, it will ever stop running by itself. And so that's a big problem, because if you have nodes on the network, one way you could just, actually we should save that for the weekend. That's the topic. But yeah, we'll burn this one because it's obvious. This is a threat though that they thought about. If you put out a while true, that's your smart contract. So it just loops forever. Then you could crash the entire Ethereum blockchain by just throwing a smart contract in that just says while true. Done. And now the entire network's dead. It's got to be reset. So they're like, we can't have that. We have to make sure that code can't run forever. So they invented this idea of gas. And so these smart contracts written in what's called Solidity is the language you write smart contracts in on Ethereum. Every calculation costs you something. So in order to run a smart contract, you have to give it a little bit of ether, or you have to buy gas for it. And every computation, if you spend a little bit of gas, when you run out of money, it just stops running. And that way it makes sure there's not an infinite amount of Ethereum. It can't just run forever and crash the entire blockchain. So Anyway, there's other ways to get around that, and simplicity just doesn't use a Turing complete language and avoids the entire problem right off the bat. Very cool research. So anyway, they did this. They put this in there. This is all very new stuff. They're still figuring it out. And there was I forget the exact nature of the bug, but there was a bug. And they had forgotten to like close off the smart contract, or I forget exactly what it was, but someone figured out they could do a recursive attack, and they could ask the DAO to send a tiny amount of ether to an address of their choosing, which was theirs. And then they could also have it initiate 2 new smart contracts that did the same thing. And then those would initiate 2 new smart contracts. So they just started this, and it created this cascade that exponentially just started transferring tiny bits of ether. But then every time it finished, that smart contract, that request finished, it spawned 2 more. And they were able to damn near drain the entire account of the DAO within
sort of.
like a day.
Sort of. The crowd actually the crowd sale had accumulated $150 million in ether, and the hacker or the attacker exploited that loophole and took $50 million.
Yeah. So they grabbed
one third of it. Yeah.
That's pretty good. That's pretty
good. Hey,
and
at that scale, a third is pretty good.
Now they face this awful question. In theory, the entire basis of this whole experiment and community is the code is law. Whatever the code says is what was supposed to happen. So the code said that, this person gets a third of the DAO. And there was a lot of debate, and that's not what all the people joining the DAO intended to happen. They didn't want to just donate their money, a third of their money they put in, to some random dude who figured out that, he could, grab a third. So they ended up going back and forth. There's this whole scandal in the blockchain community, and eventually they ended up basically rewinding the blockchain. They did what's called a hard fork. Yeah.
Which is interesting, because it's almost like they brought a case to court, and they had a jury decide on a judgment for this thing.
Right? It's almost like it was good to have people say, wait a minute, even though the code said that, that's not what we actually meant. Maybe we should rewind the blockchain and try again and make sure that bug's not there, and make sure that the intent of the people is actually honored rather than the letter of the law or exactly what the code said. So there's 2 great examples of when the law goes real sideways, and why pulling people completely out of the loop is really bad idea. Like, if you care at all about justice, it is a terrible idea.
Yeah, and I think that this is a great example of inaction of code is law. Well, if the code is law, so are the bugs. The bugs are also the law. And so you have to ask yourself, well, what do we do if the Constitution was rewritten in such a way that it was written in a coding language, like I think you called it Loglan or Lodgelan.
Lodgeban is the new one. Loglan was the original, yeah.
But if we were to rewrite the Constitution in this language, so it had only a single interpretation, what would happen if we discovered that there was a bug in it? Would that be the Constitution? Would that be the law? Or would we have to do what we've done all along, which is bring in a judicial branch and set it up and get some justices hired and get a jury going? And what would we have to do?
Might we amend this law?
We might amend it.
That's why that's in there. The framers knew we're never going to get it right. That's why we have judges. That's why we have juries. And that's why we have the ability ultimately to change the law. The law is nothing more than social reality. It's something we all agree to abide by. Well, not everyone. That's where the criminals, liars and outliers, like Schneier's book. Great read, by the way. But yeah, the law is something that we've all just agreed upon. And I think it's good to keep it as a thing we've agreed upon. Not pretend it's some divine thing that's unalterable and whatever it says. Like, no, it's something we agreed upon, and we should agree upon things that are just. And so if the law is unjust, we should just alter it. It's really easy. It's just us all agreeing upon a new, more just interpretation. It's that easy.
Well, that brings us to the end of our time and the end of this episode. But I do think that this was very fascinating and a very good dive into the problems of codifying law with the programming language, or trying to apply, in general terms, trying to apply logic to all philosophical matters and saying that logic is the end all. I would love to hear what law was like on Vulcan in Star Trek, you know? But yeah, we're all out of time, everybody. Elio, anything 10 seconds you want to say?
No, at some other time we'll talk about jury nullification, and we'll do it not near a courthouse so we don't get arrested.
All right. Well, everybody, tune in this Saturday. We have a very special guest. We're going to have a very awesome conversation about the blockchain, and you won't want to miss it. Good night, everybody.